I'm going to show you 10 game-changing tips I use to optimize the flow in my aquarium. 1. Air bubbles. Don't expect your flow to be set it and forget it. I came up with this idea 15 years ago when my hang on the back skimmer kept letting micro bubbles into the tank. I use a turkey baster to introduce air into the inlet of my closed loop. In my previous tank, I did the same thing with the inlet of my return pump. It was fascinating to see how some areas had great flow while others had almost none. I especially noticed the dead spots around my two large overflow boxes. You realize quickly that everything in your tank can either enhance or disrupt your flow. Using micro bubbles to track where they go and how your flow device interacts can significantly improve your flow. I'm a fan of the small vortexes that form at the surface. They're hard to see without micro bubbles, but to me, they indicate that my flow devices are working together to create randomized flow I'm aiming for. This technique also helps pinpoint why certain areas develop dead spots, cyano or hair algae patches. If you apply this method early on, you can stay ahead of these problems. By doing this, I can make minor adjustments to my flow until it's just right. 2. Balancing broad and high velocity laminar flow. I prefer a mix of broad laminar flow with high velocity laminar flow. Instead of focusing solely on the number of pumps, consider how to achieve both broad and high velocity flow. In my current setup, I use a closed loop system with the Ecotech Vectra L1 pump, C-swirl, and 3/4 inch adductors. One would think to just point multiple power heads at each other, but oftentimes it works better when they miss each other by just a little bit. I initially had the closed loop nozzle pointing downwards across the reef, but changing the flow path to direct it just below the surface, I noticed the entire tank got more natural flow and I noticed more detritus and debris being lifted. The way I achieve this is have higher velocity nozzles closer to the surface, whether it be a return pump nozzle or a closed loop nozzle. If you run these high velocity nozzles lower into the tank, they will not be as efficient since water moves faster when they're closer to the surface. Just make sure you're not overdoing it since it can lead to salt creeps. The way to increase velocity is to put smaller nozzles on your outlet. So a 3/4 inch works good for like 800 gallons per hour, but if your return pump is only like 400 gallons per hour, then a 1/2 inch nozzle would increase the velocity and it would shoot out a lot further. I've used a variety of pumps including MaxiJet, MagDrive, Vectra, Tunes, Wavebox, Ecotech, Gyros, and J-Bows. Each is reliable and serves the same purpose of moving water, but they do so in different ways. All the propeller pumps have laminar flow, but what we should be trying to achieve is what the ocean provides, turbulent flow. This can be achieved by placing power heads on opposite sides of the tank where they intersect. Too much flow can be harmful to your reef tank, but too little flow can also inhibit coral growth. In lower flow conditions, a thin layer forms around the coral, which slows down gas exchange, nutrient import, and waste export. 3. Aquascape for optimal flow. Planning your flow is essential to keeping your aquarium alive and thriving. So just adding a pump pointing along the surface because you see everyone doing it won't optimize your flow. Before adding water, you should plan your aquascape and flow together. These should go together like peanut butter and jelly. Make sure to consider it from all angles, not just the front, but the top and sides. Too much rockwork can restrict the flow in your system, so keeping the structure as open and hollow as possible is a great way to optimize water movement. Personally, I prefer having 2 rock structures in my reef tank, one larger and one smaller. This setup is visually appealing to me at the moment, though in my first tank, I preferred a single larger structure. Ultimately, go with what works and appeals to you. Whether you have 1 or 3 structures in a smaller or larger display, what matters most is you're providing enough nooks and crannies for your fish and inverts to feel safe. A well-designed aquascape allows water flow to reach the crevices, reduce dead spots, lowers nutrient buildup, and helps minimize algae issues. I remember in my old 120-gallon Aquarium tank, I had these 2 oversized mega overflow boxes. Not only did they stick out about 4 inches, but besides being an eyesore and completely unnecessary, they blocked a lot of flow. Having your rock touch the back wall of the tank can create a similar issue, restricting water movement and creating dead spots where detritus can accumulate. First-time reefers using Marco cement or thin superglue for aquascaping can feel intimidating. But once you get the hang of it, it's easier than it seems. Take your time, spend a week designing an attractive and functional rock structure. There's no excuse to not get it right. You have so many YouTube videos to guide you through aquascaping. Use cardboard to map out the system, and don't forget to reference the height as well. I learned this the hard way with my previous system, which ended up too low. I regretted not making the structure higher at certain points because my SPS corals eventually grew into each other. Having additional height would have created a more natural look, provided more airspace for corals to branch out. Today, there are many options for dry rock, most of it is man-made or harvested on land. Make sure to get a variety of rock type to make an interesting structure. Don't get hung up on having all the same kind of rock. It will look nicer the first 6 months, but after coralline algae grows on their aquascape, it's always going to look better when you have a mix of different types of rocks. I use a combination of Tonga, Marshall Island, Fiji, and Haitian rock. Cheaper Marco rock that is easier to chisel, and combine that with the more premium man-made rocks such as real Reef, Tonga, and Carib Sea shape. However, I'm still a sucker for natural ocean rock. If you're hell-bent on going natural rock like I was, a simple search on Facebook Marketplace can yield cheap old dry ocean rock like Fiji, Haitian, Marshall Island, and Tonga rock that I was desperately looking for. Just be sure to clean it with muriatic acid or bleach weeks before using it. That said, I'd recommend new hobbyists avoid natural ocean rock due to the potential dead organics it will have. It is better for beginners to not worry about nutrient spikes and unstable system for a while, since it will take the fun out of the hobby. I have battled high nutrients for 2 years, which started with dirty old live rock. I believe blaming this dirty rock caused me to not focus on the root cause of the high nutrients, which was just a lack of nutrient export and sufficient nitrifying bacteria to combat those high nutrients. I left a link in the description for how I dealt with the nitrates and phosphates. 4. Propeller pump placement. In my previous setup, I had 2 pumps, one on each end, pointing directly at each other. What I found is that unless you run them on alternative wave makers, the flow ends up being less than ideal. The turbulence created in the center of the tank was too intense, resulting in uneven flow distribution and creating dead spots in other areas. If you're using 2 pumps on opposite sides of the tank, I recommend positioning them so they don't interfere with each other. Instead of pointing them directly at each other, angle them in different directions toward different regions of the tank. Even though you may not see it, the flow from both pumps will still work together, since flow has a cone shape, and this will create beneficial turbulence across the tank without overwhelming any single area. Additionally, using your return pump nozzle to direct flow into areas that need it most can also help balance the circulation in your tank. One of the best investments I've made in this hobby is the sea swirls. Over the years, I've purchased 4 of these devices, and once you use them, you'll understand their value. The simplicity of the sea swirl is what makes it so effective. The way it creates flow along the back glass and ensures 100% of the tank is getting circulation is unmatched. While devices like MP60s can move a lot of water, pound for pound, I consider the sea swirl to be the champ. Its ability to flush the system with varying speeds and velocities is truly impressive. The only real adjustment needed is placement of the nozzle, and then beyond that, it's pretty much set it and forget it. The only downside is the price. At $454 per unit, it may seem like a steep investment, but much like Ecotech Vortech, they're built to last, have good resale value, and can last 10 to 20 years. If you're looking to create good flow in a smaller system on a limited budget, Corallia pumps on either side connected to a wave maker are a solid option. You can alternate them on-off to create variable flows. Another good budget option would be using 2 J-valve pumps. In a tank of 30 gallons or less, you could even get away with just one slightly stronger pump by taking advantage of how the flow bounces off the glass and circulates from the bottom upwards. Having one pump would require at least 2 nozzles for the return pump just to provide the added flow needed to create some randomness. The key is to never aim pumps directly at your reef and to ensure you have enough flow capacity. A pump with a higher gallons per hour is always preferable. If you can't control the flow, you can always have a timer to cycle it on and off throughout the day. 5. Choosing a wider tank. I remember my old 55-gallon tank being only 12 inches wide, and this created a big problem for both flow and aquascaping. With such a limited space, there was little room to get creative with the rock work, and I ended up having the rock touch the back glass. This led to dead spots and reduced the effectiveness of the flow in the system. When your tank is only 12 inches wide, can't do much with aquascape, and that limitation also affects how water moves throughout your system. If you're considering a smaller tank, I'd recommend a 40-gallon breeder as a solid option. The best tanks I suggest are a 90-gallon or 120-gallon aquarium. The 120-gallon measures 48 by 24 by 24, and the 90-gallon is similar but only 18 inches wide instead of 24 inches. The reason I prefer the 120-gallon over the 90 is that aside from the initial tank and stand purchase, the equipment you need for a 90-gallon is pretty much the same as what you need for a 120-gallon. Plus, the added 6-inch in the 120-gallon makes a huge difference for the flow, as it allows water to circulate around the entire tank and gives the system a more spacious feel from the front. There are many ways to go about this, but a good guide is to look for an aquarium that is wider than it is taller, or equal to its height. Sometimes this this is difficult to find off the shelf since most of the tanks are built for freshwater or fish-only displays, so they tend to have a taller system that looks larger from the front and easier to store on their shelves. Too bad Marineland doesn't produce those deep dimension aquariums anymore. I really like those dimensions. Their build quality was another story. With a 24-inch wide tank, you have much more room for creative aquascape and pump placement on either side of the system. The fish also feel more comfortable with extra width. A 120-gallon tank offers enough space to build a rock structure that allows flow to bounce off the glass and circulate around the entire scape, ensuring even water movement throughout. But I understand that a 120-gallon tank might feel a bit large for a first setup. So if that's the case, I'd recommend either a 60-gallon cube or a 90-gallon tank as a good alternative. 6. Nighttime flow reduction. After midnight when the lights are off, I significantly reduce the pump flow. If you don't have a controllable device, I recommend using a simple timer to cut the power to a stronger pump. This way you can run it only when the lights are on, providing your tank with extra flow during the day. Many people argue that flow should remain the same at night as during the day, but I disagree for 3 reasons. First, fish need to sleep in peace. Corals are filter feeders and need to feed, so blasting them with strong flow at night can be harmful. Reducing flow at night saves energy. These points are based on my observations over time. I suggested lowering your flow by 25% or even 50% for 3 to 4 hour window before the lights come back on. This advice mainly applies if you run medium to strong flow during peak hours. If your flow is already low, further reduction may not be necessary. However, if you're running an SPS or LPS reef with very high flow during peak hours, both your corals and fish will appreciate the reduction in flow overnight. 7. Maximizing flow efficiency without high cost. In the past, I always thought you needed a good budget to have good flow. This was the case back in the day when you either had to drop $500 on a controllable tunes pump, otherwise majority of us had to rely on these creative closed loop systems or multiple maxi jet pumps. Today, like the expensive brands, there are so many affordable options on the market that can move water equally as good. You may have to get creative when designing your flow based on what you intend to keep in your system, but it's possible now. I find all coral types can benefit from turbulent flow, and if you're going for SPS reef, there's always lower flow zones in the tank that can work for LPS and softies. So get the strongest pump that is controllable so you could adjust your flow up when needed and not rely on just adding more pumps down the road. I really appreciate Adam from Battle Corals for his simplicity on how he runs his coral farm. Since his frag tanks are 12-inch deep, it doesn't make sense for him to use a typical propeller pump. So he uses gyro pumps, which gives him a flat stream of water along the top, and just by alternating the flow offers the corals with enough random flow. Sanjay Joshi is a legend in the reefing community. His approach to coral care seems to be intuitive, like he just knows exactly what his tank needs at any specific time. And his mastery of flow is on another level. The way he combines sea swirls with Ecotech Vortex to achieve symmetrical coral growth is impressive. So I definitely want to give him props for inspiring me. In my 400-gallon tank, I'm using 2 MP60s and 1 Vectra L1 on a closed loop feeding 2 sea swirls. My return pump is a 6,000 gallon per hour Paria pond pump. I choose this pump because it's energy efficient, using only 160 watts, and the build quality is very good. Whereas other pumps that move this amount of water typically use about 300 watts. Paria pond pump is built to last, and after using it for almost 3 years, I'm surprised more people aren't using it. I think the fact that it's designed for ponds and lacks the marketing push keeps it under the radar. In my frag tank, I'm using Ecotech MP40, and in my QT tank, I have an MP40 along with a Vectra M1 for the return. If you're setting up a tank that's 150 gallons or smaller, I'd recommend starting with 2 Ecotech Vortex, one on either side. Position one slightly above the reef and the other one across the reef. If that's not in your budget, you could get the similar results by getting 2 J-Bow pumps that do about the same amount of gallons per hour. What I love about the Vortex pump is the quiet drive and their controllability. I often use anti-sink mode with the nutrient transport, and when I want a gentler flow, Reef Crest mode is my go-to. I also like that you can slow them down at night. All these features make MP40 hard to beat, but you don't need the pump to be controllable to be effective. As long as you're creating turbulence and some downtime, you will be successful. For SPS corals, they thrive in strong turbulent flow, but they also need breaks between those intense blasts. If you can invest in a controllable pump, it's a huge advantage because you could ramp the flow up and down, giving you the flexibility to fine-tune it based on your coral's need. For someone starting a reef tank on a budget, let's say with a 100-gallon system, I suggest getting 2 propeller pumps rated for 2,000 to 3,000 gallons per hour each. Place them on opposite sides of the tank, alternate their flow, Switch every 5 to 10 minutes. This helps stimulate the natural variations in water movement that corals experience in the wild, and if battle corals could do it, you can surely do it. And the best part is, you probably don't have to do any adjustments at night. 8. Keep your pumps clean. Currently, I have to clean my MP60s every 2 to 3 weeks because they accumulate so much junk and the flow gets reduced pretty quickly. When I don't have time to pull out the entire unit, I'll just remove the weir and give it a clean. Even that small step helps boost the flow. These pumps are designed to operate efficiently with a clean magnetic impeller and a clear plastic inlet. Any buildup of gunk can significantly reduce their efficiency. I've often seen hobbyists who don't clean their pumps for over a year and wonder how they're still producing anywhere near the same flow they did when they first installed it. For many reefers, cleaning every 2 to 3 weeks might not be feasible. I only need to clean 2 MP60s, and since I don't have to mess with removing the power supplies, it takes me only 15 minutes to clean both and put them back in, so I always do it. If you want to speed up the cleaning process, at minimum, you can just power off the pump, remove the weir, and clear the magnetic impeller on your propeller pump. You'll notice a significant increase in the flow from just doing that. As for a closed loop pump, I don't clean it as often as I'd like because I didn't set it up in a way that makes frequent cleaning easy. The same goes for my return pump and skimmer pump, but I still clean them at least every 6 months. Though to be honest, I've gone over a year without cleaning them. I try not to wait until there's a noticeable drop in performance, but sometimes that just happens. When I do clean them, I use vinegar and brush to remove all the algae and gunk, and then I put the equipment back into the system. 9. Flow inspired by the wind. This might sound a bit unusual, but it makes perfect sense to me. Have you ever noticed how some trees grow perfectly symmetrical while others grow odd, awkward shaped? The same factors that affect the growth of trees also apply to corals. Just like trees, corals are influenced by various environmental conditions that shapes their growth. One factor we all can relate to is the wind, which I try to recreate in my reef aquarium. Think about standing outside on a windy day. It's constantly shifting and changing intensities. The same thing happens with water flow in the ocean. Corals on the reef grow in all directions, adapting to those ever-changing currents. Now consider a perfect tree. It grows without much competition. No other tree nearby are fighting for light, air, or nutrients. But a tree growing in a dense forest will grow it tall and skinny, reaching up to grab in any available sunlight. Corals are very similar. When given space, they spread and grow more evenly, but pack too many corals close together and they're starting competing for light and water flow. Ideally, you want to give your corals enough room to grow without their competition. And when adding a new frag, place them a few inches apart, with their growth paths facing different directions to avoid crowding and competition. When I look at a well-established reef tank full of SPS corals, I can instantly tell when the water flow is dialed in perfectly. The corals are growing naturally, symmetrical shapes, almost like a perfect circle, instead of growing awkwardly in one direction. Ask yourself this: if you are a coral or a tree, how would you grow if you were constantly hit with the flow coming from the same direction? You'd probably grow away from the force and end up looking more like a stick figure. So my advice is simple: use the tips from this video to make sure your corals are getting strong randomized flow that mimic the ocean's current. Use tip number 1 and use bubbles and throw them into your reef tank and see how the flow is hitting your coral. Is it coming from the top, left, right? How is it interacting with your coral? And assume that's the wind. That's how your coral should be receiving the flow in your aquarium. 10. Understanding tank turnover rates. Almost everyone starting a reef aquarium will ask the same question: how much flow do I need in my system? You'll often hear that SPS corals need up to 40 times turnover, LPS corals need about half that, and soft corals need about 10 times turnover. But here's the reality: there isn't a one-size-fits-all answer. The ideal flow for your tank will ultimately depend on the specific needs of your system. You may need to adjust it as your tank matures and your livestock increases. When you're just starting out with the minimum livestock, less flow can be fine. In my 400-gallon reef tank, all my flow devices are running at once. I get around 50 times turnover. In my previous 115-gallon setup, I had an insane turnover rate of 110 times. But running all those pumps at the same time isn't necessarily beneficial. Aim for having anywhere between 20 to 50 times turnover, but put more focus on turnover going into your sump, as this will drastically impact the overall health of your system. Aim for your return pump to return over at least 10 times your tank volume per hour. So for example, a 100-gallon tank, look for a return pump rated for about 1,000 gallons per hour. Having a controllable return pump can be especially useful for managing your nutrient levels. When my nutrients were too low, I would reduce the flow to the sump, and this would cause an increase in the phosphates and nitrate levels, You will see a lot of people having to turn off their skimmers for the day or more to get their nutrient detectable, but this compromises pH stability. So focus on having good turnover in your sump with the option to reduce it or ramp it up as needed. Let me know what you guys think of my top flow tips. Until next time, peace out.